Yeah, I'm gonna just try to convince you of some confusions that I have based on this chapter that we're reading, which is the third chapter out of the 8 ones. And the third chapter out of the 8 ones we've discussed already. It talks about the definition of sickness of the soul, right? Remember? Remember? No. It talks about the definition of sickness of the soul.
Oh, yeah.
And weirdly, this is I don't remember if we talked about that problem with the order. But weirdly, and when talking about it, now, in general, the general definition of this we already know. In other words, the definition in the sense of bad midas, we sort of know that the general definition of sickness is this.
The liking, not things that are
liking or whatever it is that causes a person to continuously do bad things. Okay. The habit or the liking. That's basically what it means. And a good person, by the analogy to a good anything, should be doing what is good, or what is good for them. And if you're not, then that's called being sick, right? And the healing of that is to achieve better habits, to be a better person, right? When we see someone as a better person, we don't mean only he does better things, we mean that he likes better things, so that he habitually does better things, right? That's the point. And did we talk about this enough? No, just so you should know what we're talking about. That's basic, right? And if you want to know what the good things are, you'll get to chapter 4 and he'll tell you the secret, and he should have told it you here. That's one problem with the order that I don't know if we discussed in the last time, which is that this is really where it should say, and the good things or the good habits are the intermediate ones, the ones which are balanced, not too much and not too little, or they're the correct amount, not too much and not too little is not enough, that the correct amount of whatever it is. Okay, that's what a good person is in the sense of good habits, okay? Maybe also in the sense of intellectual things, we'll get to that in a second. That is something simple, right? Okay. Now, there's something more complicated, okay? And the Holy Rambam, for some reason, decided that this is the place to confuse us. Why? Because the second part of this chapter, and I can very clearly show that it's a confusion by this little chart that I made you, which is comparing the Rambam and his source. It's both his source in Al-Farabi and the source of his source, which is Aristotle. In both of them, he does a huge jump, okay? If you see here, in this page, in the first page where it says definition of sickness of the soul, starts off and gives in the first box he just gives the definition. This is where the beginning of the book is, and in Aristotle it's a little bit later, but it's fine. It's still in the beginning, like book 2 or 3 in Aristotle. You get this definition. Aristotle doesn't mamish start with the sickness. Doesn't matter, but this idea is where it starts, and then he gives a skip. He tells you about the health of the body, which is not relevant to this, okay? And we can see how Al-Farabi gave us more words about it, and the Rambam just said this is not important, okay? And then we go to the next part, right? And the next part is in the Rambam is Gimel, right? And you could follow the numbers here. You can see them. If you could see that in the source, in Al-Farabi source, you have number 1. It's literally aphorism 1 in his book is this sickness and health of the body. Aphorism 2 gives you the definition of sickness and health of what the sickness is. In other words, how this is the same thing as virtues and vices, which the Rambam sort of says here and sort of said already before, so it will say again, not really adding much. Aphorism 3 is what the Rambam does in Perek Dalet, which is really the next step to tell us what are the good habits, the ones that have an equilibrium. Al-Farabi even gave us an analogy to the body with this. It could be it's in Aristotle also. It's definitely in Plato, I think, which is that the bodily health, you're on the wrong page. The bodily health is also a matter. I'm in the next page. Tzaddik, page 2.
This one, right?
Yeah, you were in the right place. And
okay.
And you should have known. I thought you read this already. You said.
I read the first page. Is that how?
No. Because he said that he already knows the first page. See, everyone? No. I'm in a class, sorry. And the, what was I saying? Okay, so number 3, which is the next, should have been the next step, which is telling us what the bad habits are, what the bad health and sickness is, was skipped here. It's pushed off to chapter 4. So there's some order, but it's pushed off to chapter 4 in our book. Now, what the Rambam does do in the next part of the book, which is over here, letter part 3, according to my numbers that I put here, maybe, why did I put it? It's really the second part in the chapter. It's just part 3 in this paper. Is how the Rambam starts talking about some other whole much more complicated thing, and you could right away see that this is in his source aphorism 40. So we skipped over 37 parts to get to somewhere else. In Aristotle, it literally jumps to book 5 and 6 of the Ethics to get to this discussion. So there's something very weird. I actually know the answer. I'm just letting you know that there's something very weird in his jumping to this. In other words, what I'm showing you from this is that, and I was trying to convince you, and I was not wrong, but I was trying to convince you all this time how this discussion of how the confusion, we can even call it more clearly now, the confusion of pleasure and pain with what you should have pleasure and pain from is the definition of sickness. We didn't literally call it pleasure and pain, we called it liking and not liking because it's a little different from pleasure and pain. But we can get to that. Or at least we can ask that. But in any case, it's something very close to that, right? And what Rambam jumped to was that the definition of a sickness is to like the wrong things, in other words, to have pleasure from the wrong things. Okay, and they give you the analogy of the sickness here. For this, he gave an analogy of sickness of the body, which is an analogy that's already in Aristotle and in Al-Farabi, which is that, and in Plato, that sick people sometimes have the wrong kinds of appetite and they enjoy the wrong things physically, right, bodily. So he jumped very far to do this, and it's not really necessary at this stage. It's not really necessary. Okay, that's question. Is it a good question? No, it's a historical question. I mean, not a very good question. It just shows me very clearly that there's something weird which he does. And now, if you want to know the answer, now I want to tell you something very interesting. Why does he does this? And you could actually just read his book and you'll see why he does it, right? Why he does it? Why did the Rambam jump from discussing what the good and bad habits are to this much more complicated problem, which, and I'll give you another word for it, which really belongs to the intellectual virtues? You'll remember, and of course all these things are connected, but you'll remember, and from chapter 2, and this is also, is it the first thing that he says here? It's not, but it's...
intellectual as opposed to political virtue.
No, intellectual as opposed to character virtues, you remember. Where is it? It's not here.
Meaning character virtues that aim towards political perfection.
No. Intellectual so wait. Well, you'll remember that in chapter 2, if you remember, you should remember again now. In chapter 2 of this little booklet here, it said that there are 2 kinds of virtue. Remember? Mm-hmm. This is in Aristotle and a bunch of places, but it said that there are 2 kinds of virtue and the opposite of virtue, vice. What are they?
Those are
Amdam hamales.
I'm sorry, those are...
Haren shnei minim. Malis midos and malis sichlios. Right. Okay? What is malis midos? The kind of things that we talk about mostly in Hilchos Dais and in this book. Like, he gives you a bunch of examples. If you would have opened the book to go along with me, you would have found them. Like kindness and generosity and justice and all kinds of things like that. Okay, those are the kind of things.
Character.
Those are character things, exactly. Those are the things that we discussed that belong to which part of the soul?
Belong to the wanting.
The wanting part of the soul. Before that, he talks about how, on page 38 on this booklet, talks about intellectual virtues, right? Which comes before, at least if we go from the top. Intellectual virtues belong to the intellectual part of the soul, right? And these are divided into a bunch of different ones, right? There's at least 3 or 4 different intellectual virtues that he talks about here, right? What are intellectual virtues? Things that have to do with knowledge, right? Things that you know or understand or decide or deliberate correctly. These are all kinds of different things that we can say about or grasp correctly, all kinds of different details that we can get into in intellectual virtue. But intellectual virtue is very different from character virtue. Character virtue are the things we generally usually call virtues or midas tovos. And in Aristotle, it's very important to talk also about intellectual virtue, the perfections of a person, which are about what he knows. Okay? Make sense? Nachon? Now, this...
About what he knows, that's...
Knowing or judging...
Sichlius?
Yes. Knowing correctly, judging correctly, deciding correctly, deliberating correctly, grasping quickly, being smart, being intelligent.
So can't?
Yes, we did this was another class that we already did, not in this one, in the other one. You have to listen to all of them, otherwise I don't like repeating myself. But we discussed how, we didn't do it here?
Which?
This concept of virtue here has very little to do with what we call morality.
Yeah, we did discuss that.
And one of the very simple ways where you could see that is when we talk about intellectual virtue. We did this here, right? Because, I don't remember.
A long time ago.
So not what I'm talking about. Because, and according to the Rambam, and according to Aristotle, and according to all these people, to be dumb is bad. That doesn't mean that you did something wrong. Because you see, justice is only one of the virtues, which just sort of maps to doing something wrong. But he doesn't have a concept, which we think usually of like some overarching concept of what you should do, or what you can.
We spoke about like the shaita that what was the two psukim that we contrasted. We spoke about a person who has good midas but doesn't have malas saklias, and then the opposite also. Is that
Not
what
sure.
you're talking about?
I don't know what you mean. No, the class that I'm referring to now was a class in Bar Park. A few weeks ago, it was not here. But anyways, it was a long drusha based on Elizabeth Anscombe's article about this. You were not here. Okay. Madam McCoy, read it. Now, in any case, it's important. That's because of your question. It's important to remember that the concept of virtue is just another word for perfection, or for doing things well. Doing things well is not the exact same thing as what we call being good. When all the things that we talk about, this is one of the keys to show us that what we're learning here is very different from what we are used to calling morality. Because we would say something like, if someone is dumb or someone is not applying a lot of wisdom or a lot of intellect to a certain question, there's nothing wrong with that unless we have something outside of the perfection of knowledge, which tells us they must, right? So if it's your job to be smart about this, and you neglected your job, then we could say you did something bad or wrong. Which means that there's always something outside the perfection of judgment or of knowledge or of grasping things correctly, which makes it good or bad. But the actual just being very bad, just seeing something badly, just understanding something badly, we don't consider bad, quote unquote. It's hard for us to even understand how a system of virtue can talk about this in the same breath as it talks about having too much anger or something like that. But it does. Right? And that is because the Aristotelian theory of virtue is not based, it's really the other way around. It's really that the other one doesn't make sense. But it's talking about virtue in the sense of doing something well. Not in the sense, and doing something well, which is the thing that you should be doing because of what you are, but not in the sense of fulfilling some kind of command or some kind of abstract concept of doing the right thing, which not clear that it makes sense at all unless you have some idea of a God or someone that tells you what you should do, and then all virtue collapses to that. But that's not what we're talking about here. Okay. We're going to be back to where I'm saying. Okay, so intellectual virtue is, yes, according to the Heilige Rambam, to be dumb is bad, and he's not worried about this. Is very a Yiddish way of saying this is that the Rambam believes that God counts dafim, not shuas. right?
What do you mean by that?
The Mashgichim say God only counts the effort, what counts. God counts hours, not pages that you learned. But according to Rambam, according to Aristotle, God counts, in other words, what God counts, not in the sense that God wants, but if you want, like we talked, results count much more than effort. Effort doesn't count for much. It helps, because you need effort for everything, but it's not the effort that defines the good person. If someone is lucky and was born with very good habits and so on, or something like that, that's great. We're not worried about the effort. And in the same way, if someone is just born with smart includes a lot of different things, so it's very complicated, but the fact that someone is born intelligently is a virtue, and of course the fact that he uses it as a virtue, it's not, this is exactly where we get to the discussion of intellectual virtues, to make the difference between how you could be a clever person and an evil person, and how smartness relates to virtue, to being a good person, and so on. I don't know which Tupsakim you're talking about. And if there were, then I still don't know. In any case...
Meaning how you could be smart and be bad at the same time?
Yeah, could you be smart and bad at the same time?
Right.
This is not simple. So, but in any case, now, I want to remember that there's such a thing, okay? That's why each virtue, it belongs to a part of the soul. In other words, the thing that is to do this needs to do this well. The part of the person that is for understanding, or for deciding, or for judging, or for knowing, though that part has to do those functions well. That's what's called intellectual virtues. And the part that is for feeling and for acting and for reacting and for being angry and happy and things like that, that has its own virtue. And you could talk about different parts having their own virtue too, but those would be less human, like the body parts and so on. Well, we can, if you really want, you could talk about like being strong as a virtue of your muscles or something like that. Now, why am I saying all of this? Just so we understand. Now, when we start talking about, do you know, right, you'll notice something like this. This chapter says like this. Now, we're coming back to chapter 3. In chapter 3, and you'll see from my headers, their headers go, now, the first thing is, as a header of imagination, and you'll notice this is important. The first thing in the page 42, in page 42 it says, the sick people imagine bad things to be good. That's what it says. It says yidamu, which means something to do with the faculty of imagination. Important to notice such things. And then, in the next part, in the next headers, you're believing me, right? No, I mean this thing. In the next headers, it talks about knowing. And then it talks about, it says margishin, but it doesn't mean sensing, it means something like noticing. I think I have to look in the source. Okay, it talks about knowing, okay? And I actually think that when it says imagining, he calls it imagining because it's wrong. Not because it's a question of imagination so much. It says, that sweet things are bitter and so on. And then it says that in the next piece starts that there are sick people who know they are sick, but they don't know how the art of becoming healthy. And then there are also sick people who don't know that they're sick, and notice that he changed the word from yadi to yargishu. That's weird. And let's get back to language of imagination.
So I guess what's the difference between shelo yada and yadamim?
Yeah, the different words. You'll notice something very interesting, that he only uses the word knowledge for the correct one. There's 3 different words here. Mm-hmm. To imagine, to know, and to feel. Or I would say not to notice. Okay? We'll talk about it. I have to look in the source to see why it's like this. I'm assuming that this is accurate for now. And you'll notice that there's these words. The important thing is that all of these words are intellectual words. Right? Because imagining, we could talk about like a faculty of imagination separate, but really the reason it's called imagining here is because the Rambam, after his teachers, separates imagination from knowledge, mostly by the object and not by the subject. Right? In other words, you cannot know something false. there's no such a thing as false knowledge. That's just a self-contradictory word. It's an oxymoron. The faculty of knowledge means the ability to know true things, or when it's actually the actual knowledge of true things. That's what knowledge means. There might be levels of truth, but that's what knowledge means. If you think of something that is not true, we cannot call that knowledge. You can call it belief. There's different words. We might call it belief. We might call it imagination. Not in the sense of like and there's two different senses of imagination, right? There's two different ways in which we can separate imagination from knowledge, or belief from knowledge, let's say, right? One sense is where we say imagination is when you have a picture of something, and knowledge is when you have words about it, or something like that. When you have or imagination is always about, how the Rambam say, imagination refers to the matter and the form, something you can like have an internal image of, in the sense of a picture with color and shape, which means that its object is something that has form and matter. It's in a certain individual, and he would say things like that. You can only imagine individual things. You can't imagine concepts. Nobody ever imagined the color, a square. You only imagine a square, not right. That difference, not squareness. Yes. That's one way, and we say knowledge is a different kind of thing, right? It's like a different kind of faculty. It's knowing, not in seeing a picture, or we could say knowing universals, knowing forms, not in matter or forms of matter, but the form itself. Right? That would be one way to separate knowledge from imagination. Another way would be to say, and these things are connected, but another way would be to say that imagination is is knowing something wrongly. So if we can use it in our language, we could say, if for example, in the sense kind of thing, did you see that person cross the street? And turns out there was no such person. Say, no, I must have imagined it, right? Because nobody was there. So did you see it? No, you just imagined it. Right? This is easy to see in like an external, in a sense, data thing, right? If something you didn't see, but you still think is true, we call you imagined, right? We don't necessarily mean that this was in your faculty of imagination. That would be like a scientific explanation of what happened. We just mean you're wrong. And if you're wrong, then you couldn't have seen it, because seeing is always true. Nobody sees falsely. You can't see falsely. In the same way, for internal things, we could say the same thing. You thought a fact, you thought a certain proposition was true, but it wasn't, so you imagined it was true, right? So imagination is just another word for mistake, in this sense. It's a different sense somewhat of the word imagine.
Seeing here refers to like the sense data and the cognition of it, right? Meaning like, I'm just thinking of like the bird bunny example.
No, I'm not getting into that. No, but not leave it on the side. I'm gonna get stuck. It's not for now. My point is just to get back to here. When we're talking about the sick people thinking that something sweet is bitter, you said the word thinking. It's a wrong thinking, so we call it imagination. But there's some thought that we're talking about. Because you'll notice that this is necessarily so. Someone could argue with me and say, no, we're just talking about that it tastes sweet to them. But we already did this separation, that the taste, in the sense of the physical taste, isn't interesting at all. Right? The sensory taste. What we're interested in is something that has more of the intellect in it. And last time when we did that, we discussed how that might not be entirely an intellectual thing. Correct. But it's something has more of the intellect in it, right? It's something about a kind of knowledge at least. Okay? And I could show it to you even more clearly from the next part, where the Rambam goes and he does another division. He says there are two kinds of sick people. There are sick people who know that they're sick, and there are sick people who don't know that they're sick, right? Mm-hmm. So again, we're talking about knowledge. It's a virtue to know the correct thing. Besides, right, there's something better about the person who knows that he's sick. Although he's still sick, he still at least has the correct knowledge, and he's better off. Okay, for practical reasons, we'll get to that, but he's better off. Then there's someone even worse off who doesn't know that he's sick. So these are both questions of knowledge, not questions of acting. They're acting the same exact way, right? So this is a very simple way of showing that we've very quickly jumped from questions of feeling, of liking, to questions of knowing.
And again, imagining is...
And just the word for wrong, for being wrong.
But that's
for
also
now.
for sure not knowing as well.
well, if we know, we're outside of the story, we know that you're wrong, so we call you imagining. But you didn't know that you're imagining, right? If someone knows that they're imagining, they're not imagining in the second sense anymore.
So he's for sure no knowledge as well.
He has a wrong knowledge, but there's a wrongness that pertains to knowledge, right? And you'll notice this is it's even more complicated than that, right? You'll notice that this same person has two contradictory knowledges, right? The first sick person knows that he's sick, but also thinks that it's good, right? Also thinks that it tastes good, and likes that thing, right?
Oh, so you're saying he does know that he's sick?
Yeah, he could. No,
Oh,
these two things here are both in this, right?
Right.
Sick. The definition of a sick person is someone who thinks the bad thing is good.
These two can
Yeah,
be in.
they're both going into here. That's how the chart looks.
Okay.
They're not two. The two things are not separated here. They separate
I
here
thought-
within this. No. That's how the organ. I think that's how the order of the text works. The sick people imagine good things to be bad. Of these sick people, some of them know that they're imagining wrongly, and some of them don't know.
It's also a little bit of an anti.
So they're even more
Yeah,
imagining.
it's pretty separate
No,
there.
It's an anti-morality kind of thing where we tend to assume that the person who doesn't know is kind of more innocent, and the person who does know that they're erring is in some sense more guilty, right?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know.
No? Like most people say, oh, well, he didn't know, so that absolves him of his error.
Okay, that's true. Very important but I don't have the right words right now.
This person has no hope.
Yeah, that has to do with the differentiation between. It's true. I mean, when every system, Aristotle also has a concept of someone who is absolved by not knowing. In other words, for making a mistake, a shoygig or a oines, legally and also morally.
Oh, morally also.
Yes. These things they're different, and there's a long discussion of how to make them different. In other words, the person who is at least absolved in some sense for not knowing, and the person who, how do you call it? Who is so bad for not knowing? Yeah, those are referring to different things. Just in a simple sense, I'll explain you. In a simple sense, let me try to see if I can give you a simple difference for this. Because I think there's simple difference. I think we could confuse these things, but in simple sense they're different, right? When we say, this is your question, just when we say someone,
what relates more to intention than knowing, like the person who let's say realize if by mistake knocked the axe over onto somebody's head or whatever.
Yeah, let me try to use my words exactly. The person who. When we say, we have like a paradigm example of someone who is less at fault because he didn't know, because he didn't realize, right? If you drove your car at night and there was a kid behind it or something, and there was no way for you to find out, then it's you did a less bad thing. You really did a less bad thing. The result is still the same bad, but you did a less bad thing because you didn't know. But what is it that you didn't know? And what does it mean that you didn't know? What does it mean that you didn't do it? You did it in the sense that you chose to do this action, but you didn't choose to hurt the person. No, so what I think that the difference is, and that's very different, let's just be clear, that's very different, I'm just giving you a case, so you see that case, it's very different from what you're saying, which is like someone, I didn't know that murder is wrong. I think we also, even us, have this intuition that we say, someone didn't know that murder is wrong, something is very, very messed up with you, man.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like, oh, we can understand, you're too stupid.
Yeah.
Like, there's some people that are retarded and don't know that murder is wrong or something, like just mentally ill. Even that, I think, is like, so something really wrong with you. At least maybe we should put you in an asylum instead of in jail. Same thing anyways, doesn't make a big difference. It's like we still think that there's something.
I think someone like that is a danger to society.
Besides for the danger to society, no. We're not worried about it. That's one way of talking about it. But we could say, we think that you're an even worse person for thinking that than you would have been, right? Someone who knows that murder is wrong, and if by mistake killed someone because he thought the bullet was empty and whatever that happened to that guy in the set, right? That is, he did a bad thing, but he didn't mean it, or he couldn't, somehow it's less related to him, the action. But someone who thinks that murder is okay, we don't say, so now you're even more absolved of your problem because you didn't know anything. You didn't even you didn't even know that murder is wrong. What can we do? No, we say you're a murderer, You're even bigger murderer than the person that knows that murder wrong and didn't know that this is murder, or didn't know that this action would cause a murder or something. You see that we have this very simple difference, and maybe it's hard to decide what causes this
I can think
difference.
of borderline cases too, but that's not.
Obviously, but we have to at least see that there's a difference. It's and we also understand that it's sick. Someone who thinks that murder is even more sick than someone who doesn't think that. And therefore, if we would like punish him or something like that, it wouldn't maybe be for doing the action, it would be for being such a bad person. Okay, so we should find all those people and punish them before they do anything. Okay, that's just the problem that we can't know what people think. But you see that there's a difference. So what is the difference?
The difference is whether or not you have like. What threw me off, I think, was discussing the imaginative faculty as like a misapprehension of sorts.
Okay, but depends what you're misapprehending.
Right.
If you're misapprehending some fact,
this act as murderous, right?
I think it's this is the basic answer. There's a lot of more detail to get into, but misapprehension of a certain fact of the matter, of a certain fact of the case. Like I didn't realize that the light was red and I thought it was green. I don't know. I'm colorblind. Whatever. I didn't see it correctly. Is the kind of misapprehension which absolves you. Misapprehension of the general principle is the kind that makes you a worse person. And you can ask why, but this is how we think.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way easier to understand. One's a misapprehension of something like contingent and specific. Another one's a misapprehension of.
Yeah, but
then why is he called?
It doesn't answer the question that you're asking. That's what it means to be sick.
That he didn't see the.
No, that person is not sick. The sick person is something. A third thing. Is a third thing.
The
if you
person who
didn't
see the red light. That's
yeah, but I mean, the person who didn't see
No.
the red light, right?
No.
It's circumstantial that resulted in something.
Right.
Thing.
It's not your fault. Very good. It's not your fault. So what Aristotle would say, and if you want it, like I explained, I just told you that we think like this. We're not so different from in this way. We're not actually so different from Aristotle. Our intuitions about intention and mistaken are actually very Aristotelian, because we do think that we need intention and we need knowledge, and we also think that having a bad intention is worse than having a bad action, and having a wrong opinion about what is right and wrong, sometimes even worse than doing it. Or makes the action worse, not better. And we don't say, which is a good argument. People say that, right? The argument of Tinnik Shanishba is sort of an application of this, and actually that's why it's complicated to apply it to everything. Right? I don't think it applies to morality. It only applies to Jewish legalism. Because you don't say someone he grew up in a murderous society, therefore should be a murderer. I think that makes you worse, not better. It might absolve you in some other sense, but we're confusing different senses of. What Aristotle would tell you, and what he says is that the difference is, but there's a question, right? You're asking a question. So if someone who knew he only made a small mistake, he was missing one little fact that there's a guy behind his car and therefore he bumped into him. If he is put there, then because someone that thought that murder was a mitzvah would be put there, right? It's even less of his fault, right? He didn't know anything. If it's not knowing that absolves you, then not knowing anything should absolve you even more. Like this works for Shabbos, right? If you don't know that this thing is also on Shabbos, then it's your potter. Also, if you didn't know that it's Shabbos at all, or if you didn't know that such a thing as Shabbos, for Shabbos it works. For Shabbos it works. Why doesn't it work for murder?
Because intent.
No, but I wanted to murder, but I didn't know that there's something wrong about it. So how could you have Tanas on me?
To murder him.
So what?
That's worse.
It's worse in which sense? It's worse for the thinking that murder is bad is good is the worst thing?
No, because I didn't make a mistake about murder. I made a mistake about traffic lights, right?
Okay,
the way to fix me is by getting me glasses.
Right.
So what is it? So one thing that
serious infraction.
One thing very good. So having it's a different kind. Very good. So one way of saying the difference, and we have to think of how it applies to Shabbos. One way of saying the difference, which Aristotle says is. And also some Lamdunim and other contexts say that the kind of not knowing that absolves you is the kind of not knowing that causes the locus of the action to be outside of you. We say that you didn't do it. It's not the problem isn't in you. The problem is in the organization of the world outside you. We say something like, and like the extreme example of that would be if someone pushes you onto someone and kills that someone by pushing you. Say, well, I was the wood that killed that person, but I wasn't the person that killed that person, right? I was pushed. and in some like slightly it's not the same exact thing. But if my car got pushed or something, or I made a different mistake, it's the car that did it more than I did it. But if I have so it's an external thing. If I internally have a mistake, right, the cause of the mistake is in my soul, then I don't get to say I'm absolved because I made a mistake, because it's you that made the mistake. So it's even worse. Why did you make a mistake? Like, why do you have that mistake? Or we could say in the context of what we're talking about, we say that's a very sick person. There's something wrong with you. There's not something wrong. You could say there's something wrong because you should have checked. Okay, so then we get into secondary things. But if you couldn't have checked, there's nothing wrong with you for killing, for injuring a person. I don't know why I'm talking always about killing someone. Nothing wrong with you for injuring a person if it wasn't your fault. But if you're just a person that doesn't care about injuring other people, then that's wrong with you. It's not wrong with the context around you. It's not wrong with the circumstances. It's wrong with you. And the fact that you couldn't have known makes you worse and not better. And even in the sense that it makes you, absolves you, another thing you thought we could say like something is if it absolves you by making you unhuman, right? Like the case of the how do you call it?
Them having bad eyesight.
Right, but it's very bad, right? And like the case of the mental illness defense, right? Mental illness defense means I'm not judgeable, right? I'm not good or bad. I'm not human at all, right? I'm not the chalois of mishpat is not chal on me. So therefore, it's another way of saying you're also not protected by the law, right? That's why we put you in asylum and we don't ask you, like you don't have rights, or you can ask the American judges if they give you rights or not. But like theoretically, that's what a human means: someone who is able to participate in some level of human morality. If you're not a participant, you say I'm not capable of understanding. No problem. So you're not human. You're less than human. Sadly, so that's not. Again, it's not better. You're not absolved. It doesn't. You don't. Innocence. You're innocent in the same way like a table is innocent. It's not a very good kind of innocence. It's not really innocent. It's like not judgeable. It's different. The law doesn't reach you because law has to reach people with some level of reason, of understanding what's going on. This is why, yeah. So I think that the Tinuk Shenishba argument. You have to go right. Bye bye. The Tinuk Shenishba argument only works for things that are not really bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah, or things that are bad,
or that don't really make you bad. When the Rambam came and said that. The Rambam actually explicitly makes the difference. The Rambam kind of says someone that doesn't know of a God, it might not be his fault, he should be killed anyways. But someone that doesn't know about the Torah, how does he know? Nobody told him. Things like that. He does say things like that, even in the context of that discussion. I think it's because of this, because he sees those things as like the difference in Perek Hai, right, and Perek Vav.
I mean, the vision of Mitzvah Sichlius and Mitzvah Shemius is kind of aiming at this.
Perek Vav, that's the 6th chapter that says this explicitly in this book. It's of course more complicated in other places in the Rambam, but I think that's why, yeah, like the Nebuch HaPekoros discussion, right? And the Rambam believes that. Yeah, I think so. Anyways, back to that was just your question. I need to finish what I'm saying. So yeah, so my point is just that this discussion of what you think, what you know, is intellectual discussion. And that belongs to, and it does. This is the source of this discussion is the discussion of intellectual virtues. Now, why did the Rambam bring it here? We want to go to sleep also, right? Why did he bring it too early in the discussion? The answer is, because at least that's the logic of his discussion here. The answer is because for some reason for the Rambam something like this was very important, which is the concept of the healers, right? The Roifei HaNefesh. Sages, which of course in his sources are the politicians and the lawgivers, and the Rambam changed it to Chachamim, who are the healers of the soul. And the Rambam said this. In other words, I don't know, I think there's a lot more going on, but I'm just giving you a structure of a question and an answer. There's some more structures that I wanted to give you, but I'll first tell you why the Rambam says. The reason why the Rambam gets into the discussion of people who know that they're bad and don't know that they're bad is because the Rambam's structure of his argument here is to get you to go to the rabbi, to the doctor, right? That's what he wants you to get you. There's much less of this structure in his sources, for whichever reason. they don't give you this image of someone who notices that he's bad and goes to a doctor. I've not seen it in this way. The image is there, but the argument doesn't work this way. For sure in Al-Farabi, where the doctor is, and also in Aristotle, the doctor is just the politician who's making the laws. It's not like people are coming to him and asking him for it's not voluntary. They make the laws because people need direction and he's their healer, but not because people, in other words, the fact that we don't really need. I could say something like this. Maybe this is interesting. We discussed a long time ago why the Rambam changed the doctors or the healers from the politicians to the sages, and we discussed that one of the reasons is because the Rambam is living in a voluntary world, at least on part of halacha and Judaism. There isn't, he would have wanted, but he doesn't. He's not really a lawgiver in the real sense, and he doesn't have it. And the Torah is not a law in the real sense because it doesn't have police, doesn't have enforcement mechanisms. So, and for sure, when you get into internal things like this, you don't have that. So the Rambam needs people to come to him and say, give me the solution. The judge, the lawgiver that Al-Farabi talks about doesn't need that. He just says, you got to do this, otherwise I'll punish you. And that's his way of training you, but he doesn't need you to acknowledge that you're sick to come to you.
Does Al-Farabi even have this distinction of
this distinction? Yeah, this distinction of the second distinction.
Knows and doesn't know.
Did I give a quote for it? No, I didn't give a quote. There is a quote. There is a source for this somewhere. I forget. I don't have it in here. No, over here it's empty. We have to look it up. I remember that there is something. There is a source for it. Maybe in Aristotle, or in. I don't remember. But maybe that's because he's not in this thing. For sure, this whole argument where we're trying to get people to acknowledge the need for doctors is not in his immediate source.
Meaning, is this information now for the lawgiver, or is it information for the individual?
No, Rambam is addressing the individual.
No, I'm saying it's after Al-Farabi.
No, Al-Farabi doesn't address the individual. It addresses the elite, sort of. He addresses the person who's making the laws explicitly. The Rambam also in the beginning does that.
The lawgiver doesn't even know about the third category.
It doesn't make a difference to him, because if you could force people to do things, you don't need people to come to ask you for advice.
So this distinction is either irrelevant, right? What's the relevance of this distinction if this is being implemented by a lawgiver?
Why is it important for the Rambam?
Maybe when he's judging the divergent, right?
No, but it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't. Like I said, we're not talking about this as absolving people. It's the opposite. It makes them worse. It makes them worse. Like the Rambam's rhetoric seems to be something like, I think you need help, and it's important for him to convince you that you need help. Maybe it's just like convincing you that you need a law, because maybe a Yid thinks that he doesn't need a law, because we're so good we think that we don't need a law, and then we're like, no, you need a law. Or you need this more specific advice of Tikkun Amidas. And then the reason, the regular reading of this, but if you don't know, is it's really an exhortation for you to know, right? Saying, if you think you don't need a doctor, then you must definitely need a doctor. It's not really talking about that person. It's saying, don't neglect the need to go to the doctor, because if you do that and you think you don't need a doctor, you're going to end up even worse. That's mostly what it's doing. But I think I wanted to get to another whole thing here, but maybe we should just stop because it's another thing. Other things that we should put a note to talk about here are these realizing another thing another subject that it brings us, right? There's the subject of intellectual virtue, and of course the relation of that with what you with the character virtues, right? because we're not talking, right, just to be clear, intellectual virtue separates, like the Ram did, separates at least into what we call theoretical knowledge, right? Theoretical intellect and practical intellect, right? Theoretical is knowing things that don't change, and practical is knowing things that change, or knowing how to live. Now, we're not talking about the theoretical one here. That's not the kind of knowledge that we're referring to in any case, right? The kind of knowledge we're talking to is moral knowledge, is knowledge of what you should do, or how you should act, or what kind of character traits you should have. So that is the kind of knowledge we're talking about, which means that that's the kind of knowledge that is very...
And in what sense would these things ever interact? Meaning, one is having good opinion, right?
No, it's very good. So it obviously interacts. It obviously interacts, and it obviously is important. Is also part of.
Can the virtues change in like a real way?
What do you mean change?
Like
Yeah, of course, because not what. Firstly, what they are is one question. Maybe they could change. It's not when we talk about knowing things that don't change. We definitely don't talk about knowing what the good virtues are. No, we're talking about the metaphysical things.
Yeah, that's why I'm struggling to figure out the point of contact.
Which the contact of what I want?
The intellectual virtues and the practical.
No, it's practical intellect. Practical knowledge is knowledge of how to use of character virtues. Mm-hmm. That's what it is, and of some more things, but all of them tend to be that. So it's something very close to them. And really, that's where we get the real question of, is it possible to do something the opposite than you know, right? Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about someone, right, it's the question of, like, how do you act contrary to what you know is not a question of how am I so smart and I still do dumb things. If you know one thing, you don't know another thing. It's really a question of how do I know that this is good and I still act as if it's not good, right? I don't know that in my action. And on the other hand, it definitely seems like it makes a big difference what you know, right? The Rambam says that the difference that it makes is that you will ask a doctor. That's a very weird. There's probably more differences, right?
Between knowing and not knowing.
Yeah, because knowing seems to be a step that you need to have in order to do it. Mm-hmm. It's really the opposite, right? The question of the weakness of the will, right? The Socrates question, which he used to deny that anyone does what he doesn't want or does what he doesn't know, and therefore all virtue is only knowledge. Knowledge is enough for virtue. Was about this kind of question, right? You can't know that something is good and not know that something is good at the same time. If we talk about this, and even if we disagree with him, or we think we could find a way to explain that, we're still going to be talking about something very close to that. Right? So it's very important to talk about what kind of knowledge we have here and what kind of knowledge we're talking about. The second thing that we discussing here is really the question of pleasure, like I started with, right? There is an assumption here that there is an ethics of pleasure. It's not irrelevant to ethics. Not like ethics is all about what you should do, nothing to do with what you should figure out what pleasure means. Nothing to do with what you should find pleasurable. And here we're saying if you find the wrong things pleasurable, there's something wrong with you, right? And the pleasure should attach to the correct things. If it doesn't, there's a problem. That's like not the same exact thing as the knowledge not attaching with the correct things. It's like another thing, right? And this is another thing that he brought in here that we need to talk about more. And the Ram talks about pleasure soon, and yeah, we have to figure it out. Okay, I think I'm going to stop because
I'm still struggling to grasp the meaning the character virtues, right? That's something that is temporal and changing, right? Meaning it's known, but it's correct opinion, right?
According to Plato's kind of things of talking about that, yeah.
Okay, or it's not known in the same way that the intellectual virtues are.
Not intellectual virtues, intellectual objects. Yes.
Maybe the intellectual virtues still belong to the domain of virtue, right? But those don't change, do they?
I'm not sure I understand. Intellectual virtues separate at least into L'Shem knowing for the purpose of knowing, and knowing for the purpose of acting. Knowing for the purpose of knowing is knowing things that can be known. Knowing for the purpose of acting is knowing things that can be acted. Mm-hmm. Things that can be one way or the other. Because if it can't be one way or the other, then you can't act, right? We cannot change things that can't be different. We could only act in things that can be different. You could be a good person or a bad person, which means that knowing that you should be a good person, you could call the knowing that you should a more stable thing than the being a good person. But you remember that the criteria, the thing that makes the knowledge stable here is not the knowledge. You could turn every knowledge into a stable knowledge if you play that game. You could always add an if. If this would be, then that would be, and that would always be true, or something like that. And it's knowledge of how to act, which means knowledge of how to live in a messed up world, in a not straight one.
Or the laws that would make it straight.
We could get into more complicated discussions of how, what would happen if you would just be an angel, that whatever, would you have virtue, but that's different problem.
Okay. Hopefully next time I'll be a little less tired than today.
You could close my thing.